and thank you, Dr. Reeder. Thank you for everyone for joining in on today's or this afternoon's webinar. Again, by way of introduction, my name is Zane Johnson. I'm the managing attorney and founder of Zane Associates. There we go. We're a small law firm here in Philadelphia that focuses on providing accessible legal services to the average person. So I'm excited to be presenting this webinar today. I love talking with people about topics like the ones we're going to be discussing today, because the law affects rich and poor alike. However, so often it's only the wealthy who are really able to use the law to their advantage because they have access to the legal solutions and planning. So my mission really is to empower the rest of us in the same way. And so I'm excited to share this information with you today. In addition to running my own firm, I'm on the legal advisory board for Philadelphia Fight. I facilitate conflict resolution workshops with Good Shepherd Mediation, and I'm also on the board of Art for Justice and Equal Access Legal Services, which is how I came to get to know the phenomenal Mary Chicorelli. So Mary, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Mary Chicorelli from Equal Access Legal Services. We are a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia that charges on a sliding scale based on family size and income. The mission is to bridge the gap between those that are not eligible for free legal services because they make too much money, but are not able to afford private market prices by attorneys. We primarily represent people in immigration court in Philadelphia, but we also represent people with tangled title issues in and around Philadelphia.
Awesome. So, again, Mary and I are here today to talk about some of the legal impacts of the current situation that we're facing related to COVID-19. Some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today, or basically all the topics we're going to be discussing today, are here on your screen. So they include employment, stimulus checks, public benefits, rent, mortgages, those issues and how they apply to undocumented workers and refugees, state and local jails and prisons, judicial services, and student loan repayment and privacy issues. So we're going to be covering a lot of different things, a lot of different topics. Our goal today really is to inform and empower. Mary and I, like I said, are going over a lot of different topics, so we're not going to be able to get too in depth with a lot of them, but our hope is that you'll kind of come away with a better understanding of what options are out there for yourself, for family members, loved ones, or if you're a service provider, what options are out there for the people who you provide services to, and so that we're really here to point you in the right direction and hopefully arm you with some tools to be able to successfully navigate these challenging times. So before we get into everything, I just want to make a couple notes because it's a webinar. Rather than an in-person presentation, I know it's a lot easier for people to sneak out before the end. So this is something I normally say at the end, but I just want to highlight at the beginning a couple of themes that I think are really applicable to the challenges that we're dealing with and that we're going to be covering today. The first is communication. Situations are changing really rapidly in our society and communities and individual households. I know for myself personally, I'm the type of person to keep challenges to myself. I like to think of myself as self-reliant. Sometimes I'm a little too prideful, but really now's not the time for us to be sitting on our pride. Many of the challenges that we're going to be facing and some of the challenges that we're going to be covering today are too big for us to tackle on our own. So, when you're going through something and you'll see through, some of the things that we discussed today, whether it's handling issues with rent or mortgage or an issue with an employer or whatever the case may be, communicating those challenges is going to be the first step towards finding a solution that meets everyone's needs. The second is empathy. And I don't have to say too much about this, but obviously, we're all dealing with challenges and it's going to be critically important, that we really help each other through these challenges and hurdles that we're going to be facing, and also the tragedy that some of us are unfortunately going to face. So, always keep in mind that we're not the only ones who are facing those challenges. Everyone's, trying to navigate their own difficulties. And if we can navigate those difficulties together, we can make it easier on one another. And then lastly is faith. And I don't necessarily mean this in a religious or spiritual context, but just in general, having faith in something. Faith is really kind of the wellspring of hope. And in situations like this, we need hope to be able to move forward. We need optimism. I know we can't really look at the White House for faith, but there are a lot of different places, whether it's, ourselves and our neighbors, our communities, the experts that we have out there who are looking to solve some of the issues and challenges that we're facing. Just hold on to that faith. There are some tough times that people are going through. Tougher times are ahead for some of us. But we've got to hold on to that optimism. So without any further ado, I appreciate everyone listening to me preach for a second, but we're going to get into the legal topics. And so the first thing that I want to cover is issues around employment, and starting with unemployment compensation benefits. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard that under the CARES Act, the Federal CARES Act, that unemployment compensation benefits and eligibility has been expanded. So I want to kind of touch on what the CARES Act is changing around unemployment compensation, and how that applies to Pennsylvania specifically, because every state implements unemployment compensation benefits on their own. So for those of you who may not know, unemployment compensation benefits is basically a social insurance that's available to folks who are employed and either lost their job or lost wages due to no fault of their own. So there are three basic eligibility requirements in Pennsylvania. The first of which is that you receive a paycheck, and that it's a certain amount of which has gone towards funding unemployment compensation, basically. So if you receive a paycheck, every pay period, there's a certain amount that is taken out to go towards unemployment compensation. So with the financial eligibility aspect, they're basically looking at whether or not you put enough into the system to be eligible to receive benefits back. The bar on that, I'm not going to get too detailed, but basically it's 18 what they call credit weeks out of the last year and a half, where you earned more than $116 in that week. If you were receiving a paycheck, most likely you're going to meet that bar. This is really an eligibility issue that comes into play for folks who are getting paid under the table. If you've been getting paid under the table, unfortunately, generally speaking, you're not eligible for unemployment compensation benefits. So if you're not really sure whether or not you meet this eligibility requirement, my recommendation would just be to go ahead and, move forward with applying. Don't let your uncertainty in this area kind of prevent you from seeing whether or not you're actually eligible. The next eligibility requirement looks at the nature of separation from your job. And so in order to qualify for unemployment compensation benefits, you have to be out of work or you have to have lost wages due to no fault of your own. So if you were laid off because your employer shut down during this time, or if your hours were cut because there's not enough work, or because of the state shutdown, then those are situations where you've lost wages, you've lost employment due to no fault of your own, and you would be eligible. Where you would not be eligible is if your employer let you go based on performance, or in a situation where you actually quit your job. Those would be situations where you wouldn't be eligible for unemployment compensation. I do want to point out that there are situations where an employer may use basically a false pretense and say that someone has been let go because of a performance situation. Really it was due to something else that didn't involve performance issues. If that's the case in your situation, I would encourage you to go out and apply, and unemployment, the state will kind of sort all of that out. The third eligibility requirement is an ongoing requirement that basically says that when you're receiving benefits, there are certain requirements that you have to meet on a week-to-week basis. For example, you're not allowed to refuse work when it's offered without good cause. Some of these ongoing requirements have been waived. So for example, the job search and work registration requirements. So typically there is a requirement to search for employment. You have to register with PA Career Link. Those requirements have been waived temporarily by the state. And so you want to just, really, it's just a heads up, make sure that if you're receiving those benefits, or if you apply and then you're, able to receive those benefits in the future, that you're keeping track of what those requirements are and how that situation is changing, because we know a lot is fluid right now. As far as typical benefits, what you can receive under unemployment compensation, it's typically about half your full-time weekly income, up to $572 a week. But that is one of the big areas where the CARES Act actually comes in and changes what's actually available to people under unemployment compensation. So the CARES Act, which was passed by Congress, really results in three main changes to unemployment compensation. And they're meant to, help people get by these tough times. The first is that self-employed and independent contractors will be eligible for unemployment compensation if they've lost income due to the current pandemic. So this will be through a supplemental program called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. And the application for this program is not available yet, but I believe it's expected to become available within the next 2 weeks. So I can't give too much detail on what that application process will look like. But for folks who are self-employed, independent contractors, just know that this is now something that will be available to you if you've lost income due to the COVID-19. Second, recipients of unemployment compensation will be receiving an additional $600 a week on top of the benefit that they're already receiving. So this applies to anyone who's currently receiving benefits, and it applies regardless of your benefit amount. So it's an extra $600 a week. And then finally, it extends the amount of time that folks can actually receive benefits an additional 13 weeks. I won't get into talking specifically about how they determine how long you can receive benefits, because it depends on how much you're making. And then it also depends, it's really based on a total amount of what you're allowed to receive, a limit on what you're allowed to receive. But if you haven't applied for unemployment compensation before and you're interested, the website that you'll want to go to, which this will be provided afterwards as well, but it's uc.pa.gov. There's a lot of information on there as well to kind of fill in the gaps on the information that I've given here today. The other thing to be aware of is that there's typically a 1 week waiting period for filing unemployment compensation, or a 1 week waiting period as far as when you become unemployed to when they'll actually start providing you with benefits. And that waiting period has been waived. So to make that more clear, when you become unemployed and you apply for unemployment compensation, if it's granted, typically they wouldn't compensate you for that first week where you were unemployed. Now they're waiving that. So you will be compensated for that. The other thing to be aware of is obviously they're receiving a lot of folks reaching out, a lot of people interested, a lot of people are applying. So you'll want to be patient. If you're having trouble reaching someone, you can send an email, and that email address is uchelp@pa.gov. And again, just be patient. The website says don't send multiple email requests because it could delay the response even further. I don't know if they're just saying that because they don't want you to send more requests, but be patient, and I'm sure they'll, make their best efforts to get around to and help everyone. The next topic I want to cover is extended family and medical leave. So basically extended paid sick leave. Paid sick leave are benefits that provide you payment if you get sick and can't work, or if you can't work because you have to take care of a family member who is sick, or in this case, it also applies to children who are out of school where childcare is not available. So under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was passed by Congress, paid sick leave benefits have been expanded. And this expansion applies not to all employers. Basically, it applies to Most private employers with less than 500 employees. The caveat to that is that employers with less than 50 employees can apply for an exemption. So to find out whether or not your employer actually is covered under this expansion, you'll want to make sure to check with your employer. But basically, again, this expands what's actually available to folks in regards to different situations that people might be facing as a result of the current pandemic. And so if you're working for an employer who's covered under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, it requires those employers to give 2 weeks of paid sick leave where you're either required to quarantine by the government or by a medical professional where you're sick and you're seeking a diagnosis, where you're caring for someone else who is sick. So someone who has, been required to quarantine, or if you're caring for children whose school is closed and where there's, no other real options for childcare for you. And so for the first two situations where you're sick and you're taking care of yourself, the benefits that are provided are you can receive up to 100% of your pay. And the total limit on that is $5,110. If you have to leave work because of a situation where you're caring for a loved one who is sick, or if you're caring for a child dealing with child care duties, and you need to take leave, you can receive up to 66% of your pay and up to a total of $2,000. The other thing to be aware of as well, is, in particular when it comes to children, is that if you've been employed for at least 30 days by your employer and they're covered under this act, you may also be entitled to up to 12 weeks of emergency paid family leave if you lack childcare for your children. And all of these expanded benefits apply through the end of the year. So again, coming back to communication, make sure you communicate with your employer to find out if they're covered under this, if your employer is not covered, or if they're exempt. Figure out what options you have as far as paid sick leave goes. And just, overall, make yourself aware of your particular situation, but understand that these options may be out there for you. The next thing that I want to talk about is in regard to essential workers. So there are a lot of people out here who are really doing the job of keeping things afloat for all of us. And unfortunately, when it comes to protecting those people, our governments and institutions are really not doing a whole lot. And so there are very few kind of laws in place in place that are enforceable to actually protect folks right now. The one thing that I want to say about about most of what I'm going to discuss here is that if you're part of a union, you want to make sure to check with your union representative about what your rights as far as protection in the workplace are. Not to get political, but this is definitely a situation that highlights the value of unions and the value of organizing and workers kind of sticking together, because unions can negotiate for what they want because they have that built-in power of collective action on their side. And obviously this is useful because in a situation like this, we really get to see how weak our laws are as far as, balancing out the scales of power between workers and those who they work for. So for everyone else who's not part of a union, OSHA and the CDC have both provided specific guidance to employers on how to keep their employees safe, how to implement different safety measures in regards to this pandemic. But this guidance is voluntary, so it's not enforceable. Hopefully Congress will pass something soon, but for now we're kind of just stuck with that. So if you feel that your workplace conditions pose a hazard to your health, The first thing you want to do is notify your employer. Again, this is a situation where, hopefully employers are working with people and individuals to be able to, protect their health in the workplace. It's obviously in all of our best interests. So hopefully if you're, seeing something that concerns you, you can go to your employer, you can let them know, and they'll take sufficient action to be able to address that issue. If that's not the case, if you go to your employer and they do not respond to a hazardous situation in regards to this pandemic, you do have some options. So you can file a complaint with OSHA. Generally speaking, employers have a responsibility to address hazards in the workplace. And so you can file a complaint with OSHA if you feel like there's a hazardous situation there. It's recommended that you have a family member or another advocate actually file that complaint for you, just to make sure that your name stays confidential. From what I've seen, OSHA is not conducting on-site enforcement regarding COVID-related hazards. But putting the employer on notice in this way can be kind of a kick in the pants to get them to make those changes in the workplace. Employees do also have a limited right to refuse to work. And I would just kind of say, in addition to that, that you would only want to take that sort of action if you felt it was absolutely necessary to protect your health. Employees have that right to refuse to work if they genuinely believe that an imminent danger exists, and that would be a danger of death or serious physical harm. If a reasonable person would agree that that imminent danger exists, if they've asked their employer to address the hazard and they fail to do so, and if there isn't enough time to have the hazard addressed through regular enforcement channels such as an OSHA inspection. In that situation, someone would have the right to refuse to work. And what they would want to do is tell their employer that they're not going to perform the work unless the hazard's corrected. And they would want to remain on the job site until actually told by the employer to leave. If you at any point suffer retaliation based on your efforts or efforts of your own efforts or efforts that you've undertaken collectively with your coworkers, you want to reach out to OSHA immediately to file a complaint for retaliation. OSHA's number is 1-800-321-OSHA, OSHA. The local office in Philadelphia, the phone number is 215-597-4955. Again, these are resources that are going to be included in the list that goes out afterwards. Just be aware that these complaints don't often have the desired result. And so again, it's kind of weak as far as the enforcement that's being provided to actually protect folks. But those are the options that are out there. As far as a right to personal protective equipment or personal protective masks, gloves, those sorts of things. Unfortunately, there is no kind of general right to that for essential workers. Even for healthcare workers, I don't know if folks have heard, but recently CDC relaxed guidance stating that bandanas and cloth masks could be used by healthcare providers. So this is really just an area that I would really kind of end by saying, if these sorts of things kind of inflame you or touch a nerve with you, I would definitely encourage you to find different ways to get involved in actually advocating for these folks who are putting their lives on the line, really, to continue to do work that's really keeping everything moving. The last thing that I want to cover in employment is workers' compensation in regards to folks who are still working. So if you get the virus and you believe you've got it at work, you may be able to receive workers' compensation if you're forced to miss 8 or more days of work. It would be difficult to prove that you actually got it from work. Obviously, because it's a virus, you could have gotten it literally anywhere. You could have gotten it, coming to work. This is an avenue that is more particularly applicable or applies to healthcare workers. So for folks who are every day around people who are known to have the virus, in their situation, it's probably more likely than not that they actually got it there while at work. But you would file a claim if for whatever reason you believe that you contracted the virus at work, you missed time, you would file a claim through your employer. The benefits would be for lost wages and medical bills resulting from the illness with certain limitations. And if you are interested in making a workers' compensation claim, I would definitely urge you to speak with an attorney. Really with all of these, if you have specific questions to your situation, none of this is meant to be specific legal advice to your situation. So I would definitely, counsel that you decide to talk to a lawyer if you have specific questions about how workers' compensation or any of this applies to your certain situation. And then just one point on informal methods for addressing issues with employers. If you're having an issue with an employer, collective action is always best. If you have a couple of coworkers or a handful of coworkers who feel the same way you do, trying to address the issue with them. Also, voicing those concerns to your employer is often going to be better than just trying to address it on your own. So, again, that kind of working together. And then as far as employment resources go, I came across a link at PA Career Link where there are a ton of jobs there. So if there's anyone who is looking for jobs, it's one resource. But basically, if you Google, just jobs in PA, a ton of different kind of resources will show up. There are employers who need people right now. So if you're looking for a job, that sort of, it's out there. There are opportunities out there and available. The next thing that I want to talk about are stimulus checks. And so pretty much just cover the who, what, when, where, how, and why of stimulus checks. So first, who was receiving stimulus checks? That would be US citizens and legally recognized permanent residents. You are not eligible if you can be claimed as a dependent on another person's taxes. And then also, if anyone who's currently incarcerated, because they're technically considered a dependent of the state, with the exception of juveniles, they are also not eligible for a stimulus check. I'm sure that there will probably be some folks who receive stimulus checks because of some oversight. I would just say that it'd be a bad idea for those folks, if they're currently incarcerated or if it's a family member, to use any of that money because most likely Uncle Sam is going to come back with his hand out looking for it. So just be careful. As far as how much, it is up to $1,200 for individual adults, $2,400 for married couples, and $500 for each qualifying child. I believe that's 16 and under, although I saw another place where it said 17 and under. I believe it's 16 and under. They're basing, how much you receive is based on income. So anyone who made less than $75,000 a year last year will receive the maximum benefit. Anyone who received less than $99,000 last year in income will receive something. Anyone who made more than $99,000 won't be receiving a check at all. But it's based on your 2018 tax return, unless you were an early bird when it came to filing your taxes this year and got them in quickly. In that case, it would be based on your 2019 tax return. And so those checks started going out by direct deposit, I believe at the end of last week. If the federal government has your account information, your bank account information, most likely through tax preparation, or if you receive Social Security benefits or some other benefit directly from the federal government, then you should have either already received your check, or you'll be receiving it in the next couple of weeks. So if you haven't received it yet, and you feel like you should have, don't worry, it might still be on the way. For folks where you file taxes, but you normally get a check back from the government, I believe just today, a portal went up on the Treasury Department's website, allowing people to provide banking information to receive their benefits through direct deposit as well. So there's a tool allowing you to do that. There's just a few special considerations that I want to cover when it comes to the stimulus checks. The first thing is that for folks who receive Social Security benefits or supplemental security income, at first it wasn't clear whether or not or how folks would actually receive their stimulus checks, or whether they would, because if you're, if that's the only income you have and you don't typically file taxes, there was concern around whether or not folks would actually be receiving anything. I can let you know that for both folks who are receiving Social Security and SSI benefits and who don't file taxes, you will receive a stimulus check. The thing to be aware of, though, is that if you receive these benefits and you have children, qualifying children, the government's not going to know that you have children, or they might, but they might not necessarily know in regards to sending out these stimulus checks. So there's a tool on the IRS's website that allows you to enter in your information. That's going to be sent out after the webinar, but you'll want to make sure that you go to that website and enter in your information and enter in the information for qualifying children, so that you can receive the maximum benefit of the stimulus check. For other folks, again, that also applies to other folks who don't fall into those categories, but for some reason don't file taxes every year. You're still entitled to a stimulus check. You just want to make sure you use that registration tool to get your information in, and make sure that the government knows how and how much to get out to you. And one other thing I want to cover, returning citizens should receive checks, although incarcerated individuals are not eligible. Folks who are returning citizens, so if they've been released recently, they can, if they didn't file taxes last year, they should be able to go ahead and register, send their information in there and receive a stimulus check. Again, really the only thing that makes someone not eligible is if you don't have a Social Security number, you are a dependent of someone else or a dependent of the state, or if you're not a permanent, legally permanent US resident. And then one other thing that, two other things that I want to touch on really quick with regard to the stimulus checks is when it comes to tax obligations. The stimulus check, there's not going to be, it's not a catch. There aren't some sort of tax obligations on the back end that are gonna kind of sneak up on you. Really, the stimulus check is an advance on a tax credit for 2020. And so there's nothing that you'll have to pay back. It's just an advance on a refundable tax credit for next year. It's like an earned income tax credit. It doesn't count as income, so you're not going to be taxed on that. You're not going to have to pay it back. And the other thing that I want to touch on, which is relevant to a lot of other things, or a few other things that we're going to be covering today, but be careful of scams. The IRS is not going to reach out to you for your information. No one is going to reach out to you to request your information. So if someone reaches out to you and says, or you get a recording and it says, we need your Social Security information, or we need your bank account information to send you a stimulus check, that's a scam. Hang up the phone. If it's an email, delete it. No one is reaching out to people to get their information. There are ways for you to submit your information, but no one's going to reach out to you for that information. Next, I want to cover really quick public benefits. So county assistance offices are closed to the public right now, but there are drop boxes that are outside of each office, available Monday through Friday, normal business hours. New applications for benefits are being processed. And folks are encouraged to use online and phone services to provide documentation. That information is here on the slide and will also be sent out later. Just a couple notes on medical assistance, SNAP, and TANF. Those benefits are generally at this time not being cut off for failure to submit information. You want to submit that info if you can, but if you can't, they shouldn't be shutting off those benefits. A person can be terminated from TANF for failure to complete an interview. Most of those interviews, so for folks who don't know, TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, there's a requirement there that someone who's receiving those benefits be searching for work. So if someone has an interview set up, those interviews are being conducted by phone, so that person's going to want to show up and participate in that interview. Otherwise, their benefits may be canceled. SNAP renewals, otherwise known as food stamps. SNAP renewals have been postponed for 6 months, and the benefits continued. Appeal deadline, so if your benefits were shut off, and the appeal deadline, falls within this period of time, those appeal deadlines have been extended an additional 60 days. And county assistance offices are using flexibility in the verification process. So if, when they're asking for information, in many cases, your statement is going to be accepted as verification. Another thing that I just want to point out is that the state has started or will be starting to give out later this month additional SNAP benefits. So if you already receive SNAP benefits, you already receive food stamps, your monthly benefit is less than the maximum for a household of your size, you will be receiving an increase in benefits up to the maximum for a household of your size. All right, and so those extra payments will be for March and April, and will be going out in the second half of April. And all that will be received all at once. There'll be no need to complete additional paperwork. That's just going to happen. Next, I want to talk about housing, first starting with renters. So as I'm sure many people have heard, in Philadelphia, there is an eviction moratorium through May 1st. And again, a lot of this information that I'm covering is somewhat Philadelphia specific. So in other counties, you might want to check what the case is. But an eviction moratorium through May 1st means no eviction filings, hearings, or lockouts until May 2nd. If you've had an eviction hearing scheduled between this time, you want to keep an eye out for a new hearing date. This doesn't mean that folks are excused from paying rent during this time. Once the moratorium is over, landlords will be able to go in and file for evictions. So if you're unable to pay your rent, don't just not pay it. You'll want to communicate that with your landlord, give them a heads up, see if they're willing to work with you, suggest to the landlord what you're able to do. If you can't pay the whole thing, say, I can pay this amount, and here's what I think I can do in following months. Showing some good faith that you're willing and that you're trying to do something. Hopefully the landlord will have empathy. We're all dealing with challenges through this time. And what you're really looking to do in that situation is get the landlord to negotiate with you, right? And so if the landlord feels like you're considering their situation, they'll be more likely, hopefully, to consider your situation as well. If a landlord tries to evict you illegally, by force, by cutting off utilities, by changing the locks, there are a couple things that you want to do. First thing you want to do is call 911. If the landlord's still on the scene, the officers should come, and they have a directive that they're supposed to follow in those situations. If the landlord is not on site, you want to call and ask to file a report over the phone, and you want to make sure that you write down the DC number in that situation, the district control number, because that number you're going to need in order to request a copy of the report later. As far as resources, you can call the Philly tenant hotline, which is on your screen. They also have a website, which is phillytenant.org. You can file a complaint with the Attorney General's office. You can also file an emergency, I believe you can file an emergency petition with the Court of Common Pleas. And another option is to call a locksmith if you've been locked out of the house. When courts do open back up, that's something that you can be reimbursed for if it was an illegal lockout where I almost said employer, where the landlord locked you out illegally of your home. Next, I want to cover issues for homeowners. So if you're a homeowner and you have a mortgage, same thing with paying rent. No one's excused automatically from paying their mortgages, but you do have options if you feel like you're going to have issues making that mortgage payment. So if you anticipate having such problems, the first thing you want to do is contact your mortgage service provider to really figure out what sort of assistance is out there for you. They'll be able to give you specific information about your mortgage, what applies, and what options you have. If you have a federally backed mortgage, again, your mortgage servicer should be able to let you know this, but for federally backed mortgages, there's a 60-day moratorium on foreclosures, and that goes through May 17th. Service providers of federally backed mortgages are required to offer payment forbearance if folks cannot make those payments. Forbearance is when your loan provider allows you to pause mortgage payments for a limited period of time without starting a foreclosure process or without putting you into default. So you'll still have to make all of those payments up. And so then the question, if you go into forbearance, is really what ends up being on the other side of that. How are you supposed to make those payments up, or how do they expect you to make those payments up, which I'll cover in a second. But you can, if you have a federally backed mortgage, you can request forbearance of 6 months. And during that time, when your mortgage or your loan is in forbearance, you will not be charged late fees or other charges due to the forbearance, and you won't need to submit documentation. After that 6 months is up, you may also be able to request an additional 6-month extension. So federally backed mortgages would be those provided by the FHA, the VA, USDA, includes reverse mortgages insured by HUD, and loans that are owned or backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. So that covers about 2/3 of all residential mortgages across the country. But again, you'll want to talk with your specific mortgage provider to figure out if it applies to you in particular. There are free housing counselors available to assist folks. The Save Your Home Philly hotline at 215-334-4663. And again, be on the lookout for scams. If someone reaches out to you for your information, it's a scam. So, be careful of that. Mortgages serviced by the PA Housing Finance Agency are also going to be offered forbearance as well. But again, it's all about checking with your mortgage service provider to figure out what the situation is for you, what your options are. Even loans that aren't federally backed or aren't provided by these programs, may have options available as far as forbearance goes, but be careful. You'll have to make all of those payments up. You'll have to pay all of that. You'll have to make sure that you pay all of that money. And some banks will expect people to make up those missed payments in a lump sum once forbearance is over. So you want to make sure that before you enter into forbearance, you figure out how they're expecting you to pay that back. You may have the option to make short-term repayments, or you may be able to apply for a loan remodification for a more long-term repayment plan, but that requires a little bit more work. And, so you'll have to, kind of figure out what's right for you in your situation. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Mary, who's going to talk about a lot of these issues and how they pertain to undocumented workers and refugees.
Okay, thanks, Zane. That was a lot of information, so really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on some of the bullet points here. that Zane laid out in the PowerPoint, and then I'm going to talk about, at the last one, we're going to talk about eligibility. There was a question about H-1 visas and F-1 visas. I'm just going to say this right now before we get into the eligibility. It is not the kind of visa that you hold, it's going to be your work authorization. So let's get to healthcare, okay? This is pretty straightforward. If you have healthcare, or excuse me, if you have health insurance, you will be able to go into a hospital and see a doctor, just like the rest of us. Obviously, if you're not insured, you're going to have to go to the ER. And for an example, I have a client that her mother was, she was a frontline worker, CNA, and she contracted COVID-19, and then the rest of the family also contracted it. None of them had health insurance, so they all had to go to the ER and get treated that way. But they're all on medication and getting treatment now. So even if you don't have health care, you will be able to get the treatment that you need if you go to the ER. But obviously, it's going to cost a lot of money if you're not insured. The legal resources, there's a lot of information out there right now for undocumented workers, refugees, visa holders. I'm not going to get into all of the resources available now, but if somebody wants to contact me afterwards, I'm happy to walk through that with you. There are a litany of legal issues that are going on with that population. So it's better to do it on a case-by-case basis than to run through everything now. Detention. So those people that are in detention now, if they are in, if they're held by ICE in federal detention, they are not releasing people in mass. They're basically releasing people that have prior conditions or have underlying issues. And it's really a case-by-case basis. They held out at a lot of the facilities for releasing them for a long time until the population in the prisons started contracting COVID. And once they started seeing the spike in the cases in the prisons, then they started releasing the immigrants that were being held in detention. There are several ways that they can get released, but for an example, I had a client that was being held in federal prison in Essex in New Jersey, which is a federal prison. He had served his time for the crime that he committed and was being held on an ICE detainer, which is the document that basically says to the prison or the jail that the prison is not able to release that person because they have a detainer with ICE, and ICE doesn't want them released to the population. So he had an ICE detainer for a very long time. We were working through his case, it's on appeal. And because of his underlying issues, the ACLU in New Jersey was able to file what's called a habeas petition to get him out, and he was released the day after we filed. So some people are actually asking for parole for their clients that are immigrants in detention, but it is definitely a case-by-case basis. They're looking to determine if they have underlying issues and whether it was a violent crime. My client in Essex did not have a violent crime, and he had extensive underlying issues, which is why we think that they released him so quickly. If people are being held at Pike, which is a prison up in upper Pennsylvania, they just released about 40 prisoners this past week, but they also transferred about 45 prisoners from Pike to Texas. So they're moving them around and to avoid the release, but they are also releasing once they realize that the population is getting sick. But unfortunately, it is very difficult to get them out right now, and they're not just doing it en masse. So advocacy, there is a lot that people can do to support the immigrant community now and, after this is all over. In this day and age, they need all of our help, all of our advocacy. So if you want to help support them financially, make donations to Juntos or HIAS or Nationality Services Center or Equal Access Legal Services. These organizations are there to serve this population, and they need all the funding they can get. So, and again, you can join in the protests and even just make sure that your neighbors are safe from the police and that no one's calling the police just because of their skin color, which is obviously sometimes what happens. Eligibility, that's what we really want to talk about today. So I think that there are a lot of service providers on the call, but if you have any questions, just you can send it to the chat room and I'll try to keep up. The first thing you want to look at is whether the person is is undocumented, but it's not really undocumented. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at to figure out if they have a pending application. If they have a pending application in immigration, they might have a work authorization. And if they have a work authorization, they have a social security number. And that is the key to determine if you are going to be eligible for the stimulus checks. So Zane, can you go back to your first PowerPoint slide about the employment? Okay, unemployment compensation benefits for immigrants, okay? If you have a valid work authorization and that means you have a valid social security number and you've been gainfully employed and you meet the basic eligibility requirements within Pennsylvania, you will be eligible for unemployment compensation benefits. And it is not what's considered a public charge. A public charge is a determination made by USCIS to see if the person that's applying for a green card or any kind of immigration status will require help from the federal government. And they're obviously much more strict now than they ever have been in that regards. But unemployment compensation is not considered a public benefit. It is it's an earned benefit. So because you put the money in, you are able to get that back. But you have to be ready. One of the eligibility requirements is ready and able to work. And the ready and able is all about your work authorization for immigrants, right? If you have an expired card, the chances are you're going to be denied the compensation benefits, okay? You need to have a valid work authorization with a social security number, okay? Very important for unemployment benefits. Okay, paid sick leave is kind of on that same, on that same thread. Work authorization, valid social security number. Zane talked about the essential workers. OSHA covers all workers regardless of their immigration status. So if somebody gets hurt on the job, they will be eligible for workers' compensation through OSHA, as long as the company itself was under the umbrella of OSHA. So if they get sick and they have issues with, and they're trying to get compensation from their employer, they need to talk to an attorney that can determine if they're eligible. But even if they don't have status, they are still eligible to get workers' compensation. Okay, stimulus checks. Can you go to that? Okay, so stimulus checks. I think there was a question about the H1, and this is the B1. So this is where that answer is going to be. Okay. U.S. citizens, permanent residents who are not dependents, okay? U.S. citizens have a social security number. Permanent residents most likely will have a social security number, okay? The issue here, which is what is a huge problem right now, mixed status families are not eligible for the stimulus checks. When I say mixed status, I mean husband, wife, U.S. citizen, or part of the one person has the U.S. citizen with a social security number, and their spouse has an ITN number, which is the temporary ID number to file taxes. If they filed married jointly, they are not eligible the US citizen is not eligible to receive a check. This is a horrible, horrible outcome of what is happening now. But I'll repeat that again, okay? US citizen and their spouse, the spouse that does not have a valid social security number, the spouse has only the ITN number, the individual temporary ID number to file taxes. If they file jointly, married jointly, they will not get a stimulus check, okay? There are a lot of people that are getting excluded because they were in the process of getting their documents together or getting their applications filed or whatever it is. Maybe they didn't have the money to get to file the application, whatever has happened, and they don't have the social security number work authorization for that spouse, for the undocumented spouse, they are not going to get a stimulus check. Includes their children. It's a really bad outcome right now. And there are many people that are very upset about it. Like as of today, there is a advocacy group that is trying to contact legislation and the media to try to fix it. And I do believe that Congress is aware of the problem, and they are, if they do give another round of benefits and funding for the pandemic, then most likely hopefully that will get fixed. The advocacy group is, I see the question, it's on Facebook, and I can't remember it. Somebody just tried to invited me today about it. And I think it's probably called Mixed Status Families United. I think it's something like that. So you might want to look for that. But yes, that it is a big issue. So that's the main point that I wanted to get across for the stimulus check part. You have to have a social security number. That is the big thing. So a lot of, which is unfortunate because a lot of these guys have been working and paying taxes, and they're not going to get a stimulus check. So when you do have a client that has a fluid immigration status, okay? So we have a question. Someone who has an EAD, Social Security, not an asylum dockets, but worked under the table like this. Okay. So Zane talked about that. If you worked under the table, then that means you had cash in hand and you didn't pay taxes on it. So if you didn't pay taxes on it, you're not paying into the system, and you're not going to get unemployment. Okay, that's where that issue comes up. So if you worked under the table, okay, and you had a social security number, and you, excuse me, and you filed taxes based on that income, then perhaps the argument could be made that you might get unemployment, but I doubt it. I doubt it. So anytime you work under the table and you're not paying taxes, you're not paying into the system, and you're not going to be eligible for what that system provides. That's why it's like very cyclical in nature. You pay into the system, it's supposed to pay you back. So if you're working under the table, you're not paying into the system, and they're not going to pay you back. Let me know if that makes sense to you. Okay, so what I want you to think about, if you're a service provider and you have somebody that comes in and they don't have status, you need to find out where are they in their application process. Okay, do they have something pending? And do they really, the big thing is, do they have the EAD card? Okay, if they do, then you can figure out if they're eligible for the unemployment compensation based on state required, Pennsylvania state required eligibility requirements for unemployment, okay? Then I would say the next analysis would be if they are eligible for, yes, okay. If they are the next for my clients, I tell them about the unemployment, and then usually the next question is about public benefits, which was Zane's next slide. Thank you. Okay. If you apply for public benefits, okay, there is a new law that started February 24th, 2020, called public charge. If you are applying for a green card, they will look to determine whether the person is going to be basically need federal assistance if they get a green card. It's a very, very fact basis or case-by-case basis based on it's called the totality of the circumstances for the public benefits. So if you need help right now, okay, and you need to file for SNAP, file for TANF, or any kind of medical assistance, I highly advise you talk to an immigration attorney to find out where you are in the process, okay? If you're a legal permanent resident and you need public assistance, we don't know how that's going to be treated if you file for naturalization during COVID, okay? So this is all if you're applying now during the pandemic, okay? This isn't about before or after, this is now. We don't know how they're going to treat it later because everything changes so often. So I am telling people that it is case-by-case basis, and especially if they already have their green cards, they probably will be okay, but I can't give a hard answer if they will or will not, okay? If they are applying for a green card, or if they're in the process and it's a husband and wife or a husband and husband, whatever it is, and they need public assistance, I would strongly suggest they talk to an attorney to figure out if they could be seen as a public charge in the eyes of immigration right now. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that, because going through each application would be pretty difficult. And just most of the time I will say this: the SNAP, TANF, and medical assistance are for the kids of the undocumented person, because obviously an undocumented person is not going to be eligible for any benefits, okay? It's the kids that are born here, that they are the ones that require the assistance sometimes. And when that happens, you really have to figure out, you have to look at the whole case to determine if the person that's trying to get a green card would become a public charge. Okay, so then the other thing that I wanted to talk about were the federal programs before we get to the renters part. So there's the federal programs are for CARES. I don't know where, I don't remember seeing that part, Zane, but the unfortunately, and I think you brought I can't remember where it was. Are you gonna? Yeah. So just briefly, there was two programs coming out of the federal government to assist people that owned businesses for the PPP, for the payroll, and the other relief for the larger companies that were suffering. If you own a business, small business owner, and you have a green card, you will be eligible to cover for the PPP, but you can't have a criminal history. Okay. Same thing with the other one. I can't remember. I'm really sorry, but so it all boils down to whether you have a valid Social Security number. And I can't really drill that down more than I have. If you have a valid Social Security number, you will be eligible for a lot of the relief that's coming through the state and the federal government. If you don't, you're out of luck, which is unfortunate. Okay. So Zane, one more for the renters. Okay. Immigrants have the same rights regarding rent and your landlord that everybody else does. There is fear of the landlord calling ICE if they know that the person is undocumented. So if if you have somebody that comes to you that has an issue with their landlord, and they're fearful of the retaliation, then you should make the call yourself to the landlord if you can, or instruct the person to go to an attorney to get the help. I have a client that has had no water for the last 3 days and didn't tell me until yesterday. And she said, the landlord's not coming out, the landlord's not coming out. And I said, well, you have rights. And, if he doesn't come out to fix it by Friday, which is today, that I'm going to make a phone call and then explain to her how she can keep the money in escrow. So what's happening now, so there's the eviction issues, which are obviously a huge deal, but it's also landlords not coming out to the houses to fix the problems that are going on with some of these places. And you absolutely should know your rights in that regards. Talk to an attorney that can tell you what to do. And a lot of that comes down to what the actual problem is in the house. And you can put the money in escrow and then they can fix it, and then you can pay them with the money from escrow. But it is a very specific procedure that you have to follow if you do that. So I advise, if you have issues with your landlord, and it's not about the eviction process, but they're not coming out to the house to fix it, then you really do need to, you need to talk to an attorney that tells you the steps in order to rectify the situation, or call Philly Tenant Hotline, which is probably a better bet, and they'll tell you the process that you need to do in order to make sure that the landlord comes out there to the house to fix the problem. I think that's really all I had. Again, I can't really stress this enough. This Social Security number, the valid Social Security number. Okay. Thanks, Zane.
Thanks, Mary. Mary, thank you so much for all that detailed information that, I honestly had no clue about. And so that's, for folks who are, interested again in advocating or finding ways to continue to support our immigrant population. Organizations like Mary's do that work on the front line as far as advocating for people. Organizations like Equal Access, Highest, Mary went through and named them. So, if you're interested in providing more support in those areas, would definitely encourage folks to get involved, find different ways that they can help support that work. I'm going to finish up. I'm going to try to speed through some of this because I think that we're running short on time, and I still want to be able to answer some of your questions. So in regards to state prisons and local jails, I just want to talk about who's being released, how they're going about the process of releasing people. So obviously there's a great deal of concern as this pandemic started to build about how it would affect folks in our penal system. And for good reason. There are more than 40,000 people in our state correctional institutions and another several tens of thousands of folks in our local jails across the state. The conditions obviously aren't great, and there's pretty much no way to maintain true social distancing measures. And so there have been a lot of folks advocating for basically the compassionate release of folks, to expedite hearings, to get folks who don't really pose a risk to the community, allow them to come home, to prevent overpopulation in the in our carceral communities. So as far as the steps that are being taken now at this point, the Department of Corrections says on their website that they're working with the parole board to increase parole releases, reviewing parole detainers, and expediting releases for anyone with pending home plans. And that they're also reviewing cases where people are beyond minimum sentences. We'll see where that leads to. So far, I don't think that it's resulted. I haven't heard that it's resulted in anyone actually being released. Last Friday, Governor Wolf ordered the DOC to establish a temporary reprieve program to release qualifying individuals. And then this criteria, so this is a little bit different than what DOC was talking about with parole, but the criteria is classified for folks who are nonviolent or incarcerated on nonviolent offenses, don't have violent offenses in their past criminal history, who would otherwise be eligible for release within the next 9 months, or people who are considered high risk for complications due to the virus and would otherwise have been released within the next 12 months. So that applies to approximately 1,500 people in our state prisons, which is about 4% of the population. The timing on how this is going to happen or when this is going to happen is not clear. Also, some of those folks, rather than being sent home, will be sent to local correctional facilities. So it's kind of more of a shuffling around of people. So again, it's really unclear exactly how that's going to help or result in reducing our prison population. In Philadelphia specifically, the courts have been holding emergency motions. The Public Defender's Office is publishing information about what they're filing, what the results are, who they're able to get out. So if this is a topic or something that interests you, definitely keep an eye on, you know, the things that they're doing over the Public Defender's Office, because they're really trying to keep people informed. But they've been filing petitions to reduce bail, lift detainers, and have early parole granted. Expedited hearings have also been held to expedite release for individuals at the Public Defender's and District Attorney's Office. Both agree should be released. So far, last I checked, these efforts have secured the release of about 371 people as of April 9th. And so, again, there are some efforts that are being done. You know, it's obviously a pressing issue, no real clear-cut solution, but there are a lot of ways to get involved. There are a lot of groups advocating. I know in Philadelphia there are a couple different bail funds that you can, you know, get involved with. So again, this is another issue around which, if you're passionate, there are ways for you to get involved and advocate on behalf of folks. As far as access to courts and judicial services, PA courts on March 18th were ordered to close through April 3rd. And then on April 1st, I believe it was, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a second order closing Pennsylvania courts through the end of April. So through April 31st, courts are generally closed to the public. So as I mentioned before, talking about landlord-tenant issues, any hearings that were scheduled that weren't considered or aren't considered emergency or essential hearings, they have been postponed until after April 30th. So if you had any hearings that were coming up, if you know anyone, make sure you're keeping on track with knowing when that hearing is going to be rescheduled to. It's worth mentioning that the president judges in each county have been given additional authority to declare judicial emergencies moving forward until the end of May. So we'll have to wait and see. Every county will, you know, probably in that case be kind of taking different steps as far as after April 30th. You know, again, there's an evolving situation. But just something to be aware of. Just because the courts in one county are open doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be open in another county, you know, after April 30th. But as far as the emergency and essential functions that are still ongoing, in the Superior Court, that's, you know, where appeals are heard, they're still handling election matters and children's fast track matters, which would be involving appeals regarding child custody issues. The courts of common pleas across the state are generally still holding hearings on emergency bail review and habeas corpus, bench warrants, juvenile detention and juvenile emergency shelter hearings, temporary protection from abuse. So for anyone who is stuck in a household where they're dealing with domestic abuse from a family member, from a significant other, they can still file protection from abuse petitions to get protection and to get an order, you know, separating that person from them. Emergency petitions for child custody. emergency guardianship petitions, so situations where someone needs someone to be appointed to take care of them, take care of their financial situation or their healthcare situation, make decisions for them, emergency civil matters, and then so that would be injunctions to stay or basically postpone judicial orders, and then civil mental health reviews. Municipal courts and magistrate courts are also holding preliminary arraignments, preliminary hearings for incarcerated persons. They're issuing search warrants, and they're also handling emergency protection from abuse cases or petitions as well. So the court has also said that where a scheduled payment is missed for payment plan, such as like a traffic ticket, it's not going to result, or it shall not result, in the issuance of an arrest warrant or the suspension of driving privileges for the time being, but that a payment determination hearing would be scheduled for when the courts open back up. So something else to be aware of if you're on a payment plan or someone else is on a payment plan regarding that. If you need documents notarized, such as a will, a power of attorney, a temporary guardianship document, Pennsylvania is allowing remote notarization of some documents during the shutdown, most of them pertaining to estate planning. So again, wills, temporary guardianship, powers of attorney, advanced healthcare directives, living wills. So if you do need something notarized, and you're looking for to have it notarized electronically, make sure that the notary you're working with has been approved by the state in order to act as an electronic notary. Just because someone is a notary doesn't necessarily mean that they're authorized to act as an electronic notary. You want to make sure that you're working with someone who has that ability to do that. I want a quick note on student loans. For me personally, like, this was the best news that I received out of like anything that's going on right now. All federal student loans have been placed automatically in forbearance, and interest rates have been set to 0. So I was checking my bank account like earlier this month, like, all right, when is that going to hit? And it never came. And then as I was, going through and collecting information to figure this out, I was like, that's why. And so it doesn't apply to private student loans. So again, similar with mortgages, you want to check with your service provider. But again, it'll be placed under forbearance automatically. So you won't have to do anything if you have a federal student loan. If you had automatic payments being withdrawn, if you were in default, and your wages were being garnished, your money was being taken out to go towards those loans, that has been stopped and put on hold for now. And all of this is going to be paused until September 30th, all right? So until September 30th, from March 13th until September 30th, federal student loans, no payments have to be made. Interest rates are at 0, or interest on those loans is at 0. The other thing to be aware of, if you made a payment during that time, or if you make a payment moving forward during that time, you can actually request a refund on federal student loan payments during this time, during this forbearance. So something to keep in mind, a little reprieve, a little, kind of breath of fresh air as far as getting a break from those student loans if you're dealing with those. Again, if you have a private student loan, check with your loan service provider. There are a lot of private student loan providers who are offering forbearance options, such as 90-day forbearance. So check to see what your options are, but also again, check to see what the options are on the back end of that to actually pay that, make up those payments. You don't want to end up in a situation where you end up putting those payments on hold and then they come back to you for all of it at once, and it's not something that you can actually do or handle. The last thing that I just want to touch on is issues around privacy and security, particularly when it comes to internet and how we use technology. And so these are issues that we really should be aware of all of the time as it pertains to our privacy when we're using technology, and privacy when we're online. But as we, continue to move through this pandemic, where obviously the way that we're using technology is changing, is increasing. And so one thing that I want to bring up is the issue of contact tracing. So contact tracing is a public health measure that is used generally in situations like this to determine who someone has come into contact with when they've come down with an infectious disease. So typically that would involve public health workers conducting an interview with someone, saying, who have you been around, not like an interrogation, but who have you been around, who else have you come into contact with, and then reaching out to those folks. So it's very time intensive, requires a lot of efforts by a lot of different people to figure out who people have come into contact with and then reach out to those folks. And so one of the things that some countries have started doing, in Singapore in particular, is they have put out an app that actually allows people who have the app, when they come into close contact or within a certain distance of one another, if the apps are on and functioning, it will record data about how close they were, about how long they were in close proximity to one another, so that healthcare professionals can go back, or governments can go back and use that information later to figure out who someone came into contact with as far as infectious diseases go. And so right now, those apps are totally voluntary, and it's not, again, it's a separate app. It's not like they're taking phone data that's been collected through other means to conduct this contact tracing. But the reason I bring it up is, not to kind of scare or worry anybody that like now the government is following you. But really the reason I bring it up is that as a society, we often tend to be very mindless about the way that we consume technology, about the way that we use technology. We don't take steps and precautions to really protect our privacy and so often our security. And the reason privacy is an issue in this situation is because we have obviously a right to privacy, but how that right to privacy works in the context of technology and the internet is still very fluid. You have organizations and large companies like Facebook where we typically just put our information out there and say, here, do what you want with it. And so in many ways, by, kind of consuming technology in this mindless way, we're really diminishing our right to privacy. The only thing that I want to say about the contact tracing and the apps, because I do believe that at some point it's probably going to become more widespread. It could end up being a tool here used in the United States, and probably a very useful tool. But just be aware of how you're sharing your personal information, how you're allowing people to access your information, and when it comes to the use of technology. And the other thing, just to touch on really quick, is with virtual meeting services such as Zoom. So a lot of us are using Zoom to hold meetings and webinars and all those sorts of things. There have been a lot of reports of internet trolls and what's being called Zoom bombing, kind of hopping into rooms and meetings and causing a lot of agitation. So just make sure that you're taking simple precautions when you're using online meeting platforms. Don't make meetings public. Don't share links to meetings over social media or in other public forums where anybody can see that link and then access it. You can also require in Zoom at least, you can require a meeting password, or you can use a guest waiting room feature to control guest admittance, and then manage screen sharing options as well. And just ensure, as always, and this should be a rule that applies to, any software that you're using, make sure that you're using the most up-to-date versions of that software. So that if there are any security issues, with earlier versions, updated versions should address a lot of those. So that brings us to the end, and I know that was a lot of information. I also know that there were some questions that were being asked and that Mary did a much better job of addressing on the fly than I did. I kind of was like, we're going to truck through this and we'll handle questions here at the end. So if there are any questions here at the end that we have not addressed, feel free to ask, and Mary and or I will, do our best to try to answer any of those questions that you have. I will, let's see.
You want to go through them? There was a couple that I missed. Oh wait, no, I guess that they're I don't know. Okay. What happens to funds when you never applied for benefits? That's the first question. Which funds, which benefits? So Ruby, if you're still there, can you make that a little bit more specific? If you mean funds to, Zane, can you figure out what she's asking?
I actually cannot see the questions for some reason, and I don't know if I'm assuming they're not in the same place as the chat.
No, it's the chat. It's just, is it the chat? And I don't know. Okay,
There's
so
a
I'll just keep going.
Q&A icon at the bottom.
Okay, is it possible to wait too long to apply